He's done nothing wrong. That's prime time we're talking about here. Who is unquestionably one of the greatest athletes in American history, if not the world. And an absolute winner, absolute spectacular.
Shedeur was joking around, but Stephen A. wasn't playing. He straight up called it sabotage, like they're plotting against Prime's son before the NFL. What he dropped had everybody shaking. Let's get into it. The draft day disaster. When the 5th round of the 2025 NFL Draft rolled around on that fateful April evening, nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, expected to still be hearing Shedeur Sanders' name called. This wasn't just any quarterback prospect sitting in the green room with his family, watching team after team pass him by like he was invisible. This was a young man who had just put up absolutely video game-like numbers at the University of Colorado, a quarterback who had thrown for over 4,100 yards and 37 touchdowns in his final college season, leading the Buffaloes to a stunning 9. For a record after the program had been an absolute dumpster fire the year before. Think about that for a moment. Let that really sink in. Shedeur Sanders came into a Colorado program that had won exactly one measly game the previous season. One game. And almost single-handedly transformed them into a legitimate bowl contender. His overall college career statistics were nothing short of spectacular. 1,264 completions on 1,803 attempts for a 70.1% completion percentage, 14,327 passing yards, and 134 touchdowns against just 27 interceptions. Those aren't just good numbers, folks. Those are elite first-round caliber quarterback numbers that should have had general managers salivating and fighting each other for the opportunity to draft him. But instead, Sanders plummeted all the way to the 144th overall pick, selected by the Cleveland Browns in a draft slot that typically features developmental players, special teams contributors, and long-shot prospects. For context, ESPN's Mel Kiper Jr. had ranked Sanders as the QB2 in the entire draft class, projecting him as a potential top 15 selection. Other mock drafts had him going in the 1st or 2nd round at the absolute latest. So what in the world happened? How does a quarterback with that kind of production, that kind of pedigree, that kind of obvious talent fall 3 full rounds past where he should have been selected?
Well, without question, Shedeur Sanders is the most popular third-string quarterback in the entire NFL. And if you're paying attention to what's going on in Cleveland, okay, the reality is that you have a lot of people there that are anxiously awaiting him stepping on the field.
And that's where Stephen A. Smith enters the picture, absolutely furious and ready to call out what he believed was happening behind closed doors in NFL war rooms across the country. On April 26, 2025, immediately following the draft, Smith went absolutely nuclear on his show, delivering one of his most passionate and controversial rants in recent memory. Shame on you. This is a damn shame. I'm sick to my stomach. All 32 teams tried to teach him a lesson, Smith thundered, his voice rising with each word as he accused NFL ownership of engaging in coordinated collusion specifically designed to punish Shedeur Sanders. But punish him for what exactly? According to Smith and numerous other analysts who began connecting the dots, the real reason Sanders fell had absolutely nothing to do with his arm strength, his decision-making, his leadership abilities, or any legitimate football concerns. Instead, it had everything to do with his last name, his father's larger-than-life personality, and the perceived baggage that would come with drafting a Sanders into your organization. You see, Shedeur's father is none other than Deion Primetime Sanders, one of the most electric, charismatic, and yes, controversial athletes in American sports history. Deion Sanders was an absolute phenomenon during his playing days. A shutdown cornerback, a dangerous return specialist, and even a legitimate base-stealing threat in Major League Baseball during the summers. He talked trash with the best of them, he backed it up on the field every single Sunday, and he never ever apologized for his confidence or his swagger.
His daddy may be the greatest athlete we've ever seen in American history. I mean, we could throw Bo Jackson out there, we could throw a few others out there, but how can we definitively say we have seen a greater athlete than primetime Deion Sanders?
And apparently that's exactly what scared NFL owners and general managers away from Shedeur. Reports began surfacing that multiple teams had removed Sanders from their draft boards entirely, not because of football reasons, but because ownership explicitly told their personnel departments to stay away from him. Radio host Boomer Esiason revealed on CBS that he had heard from multiple sources that owners had instructed their GMs. They took him off because the owner said, take him off. I don't want that guy. The concerns? They were numerous and frankly deeply troubling when you really examine them closely. Some organizations worried that Deion would be a constant presence in the building, potentially undermining the coaching staff and creating distractions. Others feared that the Sanders family would try to dictate which team Shedeur went to, potentially refusing to play for organizations they deemed unsuitable. There were whispers that Shedeur had bombed interviews spectacularly, taking FaceTime calls mid-meeting and demanding that teams commit to starting him immediately rather than allowing him to develop. One anonymous general manager reportedly called Sanders entitled, saying he torpedoed himself by demanding wholesale cultural changes before he'd even thrown a single NFL pass. Another team official allegedly stated that Sanders came across as someone who expected to run the organization day one inch rather than earn his stripes the traditional way that rookie quarterbacks are expected to. But here's where Stephen A. Smith's argument becomes absolutely compelling and impossible to ignore. If these concerns were so legitimate, if these red flags were so glaring and obvious, why didn't a single team leak them before the draft? Why did Sanders still maintain a first-round grade from major scouting services and media analysts if his interviews were supposedly that disastrous? And most importantly, why did it feel like there was a coordinated league-wide effort to make an example out of him? Pro Football Hall of Famer Eric Dickerson added fuel to the fire when he suggested that teams were specifically told not to draft Sanders, potentially by Commissioner Roger Goodell himself, and what Dickerson implied was an effort to send a message to high-profile prospects and their families about who really controls the NFL draft process. Antonio Brown went even further, alleging that owners had conspired against Sanders because they resented Deion's outspoken criticism of the league and didn't want to empower someone who might challenge their authority.
Like Primetime talking before the draft about how his son gonna listen to him, how they're gonna evaluate the process, and his son gonna do what his daddy wants him to do. We gotta remember stuff like that.
And if all of this wasn't dramatic enough, if the draft day fall wasn't humiliating enough for a young man who had done absolutely everything right on the football field, what happened next in Cleveland would take this entire saga to even more controversial and explosive heights. The Browns selected Sanders with the 144th overall pick, bringing him into an organization that already had a bloated quarterback room featuring aging veteran Joe Flacco, struggling former starter Deshaun Watson, and third-round rookie Dylan Gabriel. But here's where things get really interesting and really suspicious, depending on who you ask. Cleveland Browns owner Jimmy Haslam, who has a well-documented history of meddling in football operations, made some absolutely eyebrow-raising comments just months after the draft that sent shockwaves through the NFL media landscape and gave Stephen A. Smith even more ammunition for his collusion theories. On July 29, 2025, Haslam told reporters, "I didn't think Barry would draft. Shedeur, that's Andrew's call. He made the call to pick Shedeur." Think about that statement for a moment. The owner of an NFL franchise, speaking publicly about a fifth-round draft pick, which is already unusual in itself, specifically distancing himself from the decision and making it crystal clear that if this pick doesn't work out, if Sanders doesn't develop into the quarterback they hoped for, the blame rests entirely on general manager Andrew Barry's shoulders, not his own. This wasn't lost on Stephen A. Smith, who immediately pounced on Haslam's comments, accusing the Browns owner of setting Sanders up to fail and engaging in what Smith characterized as a publicity stunt that jeopardized Sanders' breakout. The implication was clear. Haslam had either been pressured into drafting Sanders by the league office or had done so purely for the marketing appeal and jersey sales that would come with having Deion Sanders' son on the roster, but now wanted plausible deniability if things went sideways. Skip Bayless echoed these concerns, while former NFL linebacker Ryan Clark tweeted, "Andrew Barry gets to take credit because the owner wanted nothing to do with it," a post that garnered over 19,000 likes and sparked intense debate about whether the Browns were genuinely committed to developing Sanders or simply using him as a marketing tool while keeping him buried on the depth chart. The preseason sabotage, and the mime. As training camp opened in late July and early August of 2025, Shedeur Sanders found himself in an absolutely bizarre and frustrating position for a quarterback who had been selected to address a desperate organizational need. Despite the Browns' offense being an absolute train wreck, we're talking historically bad levels of incompetence, and despite having one of the NFL's most dominant defenses led by defensive end Myles Garrett, who was making a legitimate case as the best player in football on that side of the ball, Sanders couldn't get meaningful practice repetitions with the first-team offense.
And you know if anything's holding them back, what's really holding them back, more so than anything else, it's their offense. It's not their defense.
Think about how absolutely maddening this must have been for the young quarterback. He was practicing almost exclusively with backup offensive linemen, backup receivers, backup tight ends, essentially getting zero meaningful game speed preparation against quality competition. Meanwhile, 39-year-old Joe Flacco was getting first-team reps, along with Dylan Gabriel, the third-round pick who had been drafted 2 full rounds ahead of Sanders. And here's where Stephen A. Smith really started ramping up his criticism of the Cleveland Browns organization, because what happened next looked like either gross gross incompetence or deliberate sabotage, depending on your perspective. On August 8th, 2025, the Browns started Sanders in their preseason opener against the Carolina Panthers, throwing him into live game action despite having given him minimal preparation with the actual players he'd be taking the field with. Sanders actually performed admirably under the circumstances, completing 14 of 23 passes for 138 yards and 2 touchdowns in what should have been viewed as an encouraging debut. He showed poise in the pocket, good decision-making, and the kind of accuracy that had made him so successful in college. But then came the preseason finale against the Los Angeles Rams, where Sanders was absolutely brutalized behind a makeshift offensive line, getting sacked 5 times while completing just 3 of 11 passes before being mercifully pulled from the game. Stephen A. Smith went ballistic, arguing on his August 7th episode of First Take that the Browns were setting him up to fail. No first-team reps, just backups, and questioning whether owner Jimmy Haslam's motives were genuine or whether this was all an elaborate charade. Smith's argument was compelling. If you genuinely believe in a quarterback prospect enough to draft him, why would you throw him into the fire without proper preparation and support? Why would you give him virtually no chance to succeed and then use his struggles as justification for keeping him buried on the depth chart? By the time the regular season rolled around, Sanders had been officially designated as the QB3, the third-string quarterback behind both Flacco and Gabriel. For context, this is an absolutely embarrassing position for someone who had been projected as a potential franchise quarterback just months earlier. Third-string quarterbacks typically don't dress for games, don't get practice reps, and essentially serve as clipboard holders and practice squad bodies. On September 2nd, 2025, Sanders spoke to reporters about the situation, and you could hear the frustration and disrespect he felt practically dripping from his words. "I feel disrespected," he admitted, though he tried to maintain professionalism and avoid completely burning bridges with the organization. But things were about to get even stranger, even more controversial, and even more viral. On October 1st, 2025, following a practice session where the Browns had shuffled their quarterback depth chart yet again, Sanders approached the media scrum for his mandatory post-practice availability. What happened next was absolutely unprecedented in NFL history and would become one of the most talked about moments of the entire season.
He's pantomiming as if he's speaking, but he's really not really saying anything, okay? He's moving his lips, he's moving his body language, etc., but he's not saying anything.
That's right. Sanders stood in front of the assembled media members and completely mimed his responses. He moved his mouth as if speaking. He gestured with his hands as if making points. He nodded and shook his head as if answering questions, but absolutely zero sound came out of his mouth. He performed this silent pantomime routine for several excruciating, awkward minutes before smiling slightly and walking away, leaving reporters absolutely stunned and confused about what they had just witnessed. The video went absolutely nuclear on social media, with reactions split sharply down the middle. Critics like former NFL linebacker Emmanuel Acho immediately labeled Sanders' behavior as immature, arguing that it demonstrated a lack of professionalism and suggested he wasn't ready for the mental and emotional demands of being an NFL quarterback. ESPN analyst Dan Orlovsky piled on, calling it a maturity red flag that raised serious questions about Sanders' leadership capabilities and his ability to handle adversity. But Stephen A. Smith, he saw something completely different in that bizarre mime performance, and his defense of Sanders on October 2nd's episode of First Take might have been his most passionate and thought-provoking take yet on this entire saga.
To me, what he was saying is, no matter what I say, it's going to be taken out of context or it's going to be blown up and exploited, and it's not going to do me any good. It's only going to be harmful. Because you know how people are.
Smith argued that Sanders was making an incredibly sophisticated point, that he had been placed in an impossible situation where anything he said would be weaponized against him. If he expressed confidence in his abilities, he'd be labeled arrogant. If he showed frustration with his demotion, he'd be called a malcontent. If he praised the coaching staff, he'd be seen as fake. If he criticized anything, he'd be viewed as a locker room cancer. So by saying nothing, quite literally nothing, Sanders was highlighting the absurdity of the media circus that surrounded him purely because of who his father was. I think it's unfair. He's saying, "If you don't hear me, that's cool. People prejudge him," Smith explained, calling out what he viewed as blatant double standards in how Sanders was being covered compared to other rookie quarterbacks who weren't, dealing with the same level of scrutiny and skepticism. But Smith wasn't finished. On October 1st, in his most explosive and controversial segment yet, he absolutely eviscerated the Browns' decision to keep Joe Flacco as the QB2 ahead of Sanders, calling it politics and evidence of ongoing sabotage by the franchise's leadership. Why do you get Joe Flacco at QB2 when you know it should be Shedeur Sanders? This is the stuff that makes you think politics. Flacco's not what he was. He belongs on an NFL roster to help youngsters, but not ahead of Shedeur. What the hell is going on in Cleveland? Smith thundered, his frustration and anger palpable as he broke down what he saw as an increasingly obvious pattern of the Browns deliberately mishandling their most talented young quarterback.
He was a bit too harsh with Shedeur Sanders. And by the way, I was on the record saying he shouldn't be a QB3. He should be a QB2 because we know you ain't putting Joe Flacco back in the damn game.
Smith connected this to broader issues of sabotage, referencing several specific data points that painted a damning picture of organizational dysfunction. Sanders' lack of first-team practice repetitions during training camp, where he'd been relegated to working exclusively with backups. Haslam's public distancing from the draft decision, with "that's Andrew Berry's call to draft Sanders, not mine" comment, and what Smith characterized as the preseason setup to fail, where Sanders had been thrown into live game action without adequate preparation. The timing of Smith's rant was particularly significant because it came as the Browns were stumbling to a disastrous one. For a start, with their offense looking absolutely anemic and their quarterback play ranging from mediocre to outright terrible. Flacco, despite his veteran status, had been struggling mightily, posting a 58% completion percentage with 5 interceptions through the first month of the season. Meanwhile, Gabriel had shown flashes but clearly wasn't ready to be a full-time NFL starter. And through it all, Sanders remained glued to the bench, his talent and potential wasting away as the Browns continued their death march toward another lost season. The frustration was palpable not just from Stephen A. Smith, but from Browns fans who had embraced Sanders despite his low draft position, with his jersey becoming one of the top-selling items in the team's pro shop despite him never having taken a regular season snap. The racism allegations. As September turned into October and the Browns season continued its free fall toward irrelevance, the discourse surrounding Shedeur Sanders evolved from questions about playing time and development into something far more serious, far more incendiary, and far more uncomfortable for the NFL to confront: explicit allegations of racism, systematic discrimination, and coordinated collusion among league ownership. By late September 2025, with Sanders still stuck at QB3 and the Browns showing absolutely no indication they planned to give him meaningful playing time, several prominent media figures and former players began explicitly calling out what they viewed as racial bias in how the young quarterback was being treated. A podcaster made the accusation bluntly: "They will never let Shedeur Sanders play. Racist ownership will not allow it," citing the suppression of his marketing potential despite his #1 rookie jersey sales. These weren't fringe voices or conspiracy theorists making these claims. Former NFL superstar Cam Newton weighed in on his podcast, discussing how Shedeur brings circus-like attention but massive value. Browns keep him for marketing, while simultaneously refusing to actually let him play football. Jason Kelce, the recently retired Philadelphia Eagles center and increasingly influential media personality, issued a warning to Haslam on his podcast about the growing controversy surrounding Shedeur Sanders and the potential public relations nightmare the Browns were creating. On October 1st, as the mime incident exploded across social media, one posted what became one of the most viral takes on the entire situation: "2025 racism still alive," in reference to Sanders' demotion and treatment, with the post receiving tens of thousands of likes, retweets, and emotional responses from fans who saw echoes of historical discrimination in how the Browns were handling their young black quarterback. But the racism allegations went beyond just Sanders' individual treatment in Cleveland. Multiple analysts began connecting his draft day slide to broader patterns of how black quarterbacks, particularly those with outspoken families or strong personalities, have historically been evaluated and marginalized in the NFL. ESPN's Ryan Clark faced significant backlash when he suggested that race was behind NFL evaluators anonymously criticizing Sanders for personality traits and interview performances that might have been viewed as confidence or leadership if displayed by white quarterback prospects. The double standard was glaring to many observers. Why was Sanders labeled arrogant for expressing belief in his abilities when white quarterbacks like Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes had been celebrated for similar swagger during their draft processes?
It makes his son an individual that needs to be aware of his circumstances, needs to be aware of the fact that you are primetime Deion's son. And you got to watch what you say.
The collusion theories, meanwhile, continued to gain traction and credibility as more information emerged about the draft process. According to this theory, owners were sending a message not just to Shedeur Sanders and Deion Sanders, but to all high-profile prospects and their families. You don't get to dictate terms, you don't get to criticize the league, and you certainly don't get to challenge ownership's authority without facing serious consequences. Sanders' fall to the 5th round, despite his obvious first-round talent, was the punishment, a very public example of what happens when you step out of line. But not everyone agreed with these explosive allegations. Dave Portnoy of Barstool Sports went on a public tirade, calling Stephen A. Smith's racism angle insane and attributing Sanders' slide entirely to his own pre-draft red flags, including refusing to do workouts, the poor interview performances, and the demanding of cultural overhauls. General Manager Andrew Berry himself defended the quarterback hierarchy as merit-based, arguing that Gabriel's mobility and college experience gave him an edge over Sanders early in their development, and that the depth chart placement Cleveland had nothing to do with race, politics, or ownership interference. So where does all of this leave us? As of October 3rd, 2025, Shedeur Sanders remains the Cleveland Browns' third-string quarterback, having not taken a single regular season snap despite being one of the most accomplished college quarterbacks in recent memory. The Browns are 1-4, and their season is rapidly circling the drain, with their offense ranked among the worst in the NFL, and their quarterback play ranging from inadequate to actively harmful.
Unless Dillon Gabriel goes out there and plays lights out and has Cleveland in position to legitimately compete for a playoff spot, you are going to see Shedeur Sanders this year.
Stephen A. Smith has made it clear he believes Sanders will get his opportunity, predicting that unless Gabriel dramatically improves, Browns fans will demand to see what their fifth-round quarterback can do, potentially as soon as week 13, 14, or 15. The public appetite for Sanders is undeniable. His popularity extends far beyond typical fifth-round rookie territory, with fans showing up to training camp practices specifically to watch him throw, and his merchandise flying off shelves despite his lack of playing time. But what happens if and when Sanders finally gets his shot? That's the question that has the entire NFL world watching Cleveland with a mixture of fascination and dread. If Sanders struggles, and the odds would certainly be stacked against him after months of rust, limited preparation, and essentially no meaningful game repetitions, the world will know immediately, and his critics will pounce, using his failure as vindication for everything they said about him being overrated, entitled, and unready for the NFL.
And hopefully, when it does happen, he's ready. Because if he's not, the world's gonna know that too.
But if Sanders succeeds, if he comes in and lights up opposing defenses the way he did throughout his college career, if he shows that elite arm talent, that poise under pressure, that ability to make all the throws and lead his team down the field in critical moments, then the Browns organization, Jimmy Haslam, the NFL ownership group, and every general manager who passed on him in the draft will have to answer some extremely uncomfortable questions about why they let him slip so far, why they denied him opportunities, and whether their evaluations were truly about football or about something else entirely. The stakes extend far beyond just Shedeur Sanders' individual career. This saga has become a referendum on how the NFL evaluates and treats young black quarterbacks with famous families, strong personalities, and the confidence to believe they deserve starting opportunities immediately. It's raised serious questions about the power dynamics between ownership, management, and players, and whether the league has learned anything from past controversies involving player empowerment and social justice issues. For Stephen A. Smith, who has staked significant professional credibility on defending Sanders and calling out what he views as systemic mistreatment, the resolution of this story will be particularly significant. If Sanders fails, Smith's critics will claim he let his personal relationship with Deion Sanders cloud his judgment and led him to defend an undeserving prospect. But if Sanders succeeds, Smith will have been vindicated in his belief that this was never about football ability, but rather about an establishment trying to send a message about knowing your place and not challenging traditional power structures. As for the Browns themselves, they remain in a state of organizational chaos, with questions about head coach Kevin Stefanski's future, general manager Andrew Berry's decision-making, and owner Jimmy Haslam's level of involvement in football operations dominating local and national media coverage. The dysfunction has become so pronounced that sell the team chants have reportedly broken out at home games, with frustrated fans desperate for competent leadership and tired of watching their franchise make the same mistakes over and over again. Well, that's it for this video, but don't go anywhere because we've got plenty more heat for you. Just tap any of the cards on your screen right now and keep it locked,